We were talking about speed today. Now we go to London. Hi again, Chris.
Hi Nikolai, how are you?
Fine, thank you. What about yourself?
Pretty
Okay.
good.
So
nice to see some friendly faces
Oh,
there.
you
I
see
can
us.
see Lucia very well.
Okay. Okay, so now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Boris Nikolsky, who is presiding the session. He will introduce you in Russian, okay?
Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there.
Chris Керри, профессор греческого языка, University College of London. Крис Керри учился и начинал работать в Кембридже, и его диссертация была посвящена Пиндеру. И Пиндер остался его главной любовью до сих пор. Сейчас в Лондоне он преподает греческую драму, трагедию и комедию, Афинский закон и читает Геродота. Вот. И доклад его будет общественное звучание поэтического голоса. Okay, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Firstly, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak, and I'm very sorry that I can't be with you there in person. I'm telling the truth when I say I would rather just now be in Moscow than in London. My interest here is the collective identity created in texts for publishing. Unlike monodic forms, the singer in a collective event is not an autonomous voice, but a representative of a group. I want to discuss the strategies available for generating this identity in Greek cult songs, and I want to discuss the way in which Horace appropriates these strategies. Although there is a variety of ways in which identity can be constructed, I'm interested here not in oblique, but in overt and explicit ways of creating identity. Can I just check you're still hearing me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, excellent, thank you. A straightforward way, example of the way in which identity is constructed, is offered by the paean of Isilos of Epidavros. You have that as text 5. His inscribed paean opens with a gesture which formally separates the speaker from the group. The former is unspecified, the latter is identified as the people of Epidavros. This element of implied or explicit separation in which the speaker uses deixis to step out implicitly from the collective seems to be a common opening gesture in public contexts. It occurs on occasion in ritual moments in the Victory Ode, as for instance in text 2 and text 1 on your handout. The paean of, I should say that Isilos then goes on at the end of the poem to firmly embed the speaker back in the kinship group.
I'm sorry, I think that there is some problem with connection now.
Oh.
It's okay, it's okay.
Yes, now it's okay.
You've got me?
Yeah.
This is Major Tom to ground control.
Yeah.
You have me there. Okay, I'm stepping through the door. Tropolin and Harmois relocate the speaker back into the group. The paean of Isilos illustrates in a nutshell the various tropes available in the articulation of the ritual voice. And much of what we find in more ambitious cult lyric is in fact very similar to what we find in Isilos, more clever. If you can look at text 6, the fourth paean of Pindar, you find all of the features that we have in Isilos. The speaker goes unspecified, but the third person at the opening of the text, the reference to keos, not harming, hesuchion, keo, implicitly separates the speaking voice from the beneficiary of the song. But as the speaker's identity begins to take shape, the voice merges with that of the population. But the simple we of Isilos is replaced by a first-person singular, which speaks to the chorus, but beyond the chorus develops a shifting identity. We begin with a neat division between polis and population in lines 13 to 16. Carthaion men elakunoton sternon ktonos, says the speaker, and then something babylonos, presumably a negative, amepsomai. But the effect of this distinction is to tie citizen and city by emphasizing the bond of loyalty which links them. This presentation of the speaking voice becomes more ambiguous in the lines that follow. In lines 21 to 24, Naion strongly suggests the human inhabitants. And so too does Parechon. The third person, Arura Fere, in 25, again seems to differentiate the speaker from the location. But the words anhippos eimi are more ambiguous. This can of course mean not riding, and therefore can point to a human being. And that, I think, is suggested by the following bounomios and esteros. I am unskilled in pasturing cattle. But there's also, I think, a suggestion unfit for horses, a reading which is tacitly implied by the Homeric intertext, if you look at text 7 and 8. What we have then, I think, is something that hovers between this human who doesn't ride and a location which is unsuitable for horses. This is an unusually bold, if understated, effect. The speaking voice, while always being the singing chorus, also becomes at intervals a typical inhabitant, or collectively the inhabitants and the island itself. This is not just an aesthetic effect, though it is a very clever aesthetic effect. The presentation of the contemporary population as modest in its ambitions, which is picked up in the treatment of Melampus in the mythic section, text 9 of your handout, allows the song to give a depiction of Sophros Eumer, both mythical ancestor and people are content with a little and reject the desire for more. Sophros Eumer is presented as an embedded aspect of Chaean identity over time from the mythic past to the present. This also, I think, presents an ideal of devotion to country, and through the effective crystallization of the population into a single voice, gives a powerful sense of unity, otherwise encountered, I think, only in the tragic chorus. This again is a strategic feature. It's picked up in Melampus's rejection of the divisions which come with wealth. That's line 53 of the text. If we look back, we can see that this aspect of the culture was prepared in the opening request for Hesuchion, not just blessings, but very specifically the blessing of internal tranquility. In a world where socio-political tension was always a source of anxiety, this is a very compelling presentation. But D'Alessio and Haji Mikhail have argued recently that this image of tranquility may not in fact be the case. There may have been tensions within chaos in the period after the foundation of the Delian League. So the image given by Pindar here may be as much persuasive definition as depiction of the reality on the ground. But as an exercise in lateral inclusiveness, it is very finely judged. It's also well judged as an act of communication with the wider Greek world beyond the festival. In presenting chaos as an example of Sophros Eumer, Pindar makes it moral exemplar. The larger themes in this poem reach out beyond the moment of performance to bid for re-performance, and with it, the projection laterally in space and forward in time of the self-image of the island. The ambiguities of voice which we find in Paean 4 recur in Paean 2. You have text 10, 11 and 12 on your handout. Again, we begin with a gesture which separates the speaking voice from the population. Before the first person unemphatically but unambiguously merges with the people in line 25. In text 11, I live, we become an inhabitant. This identity is continued in line 29, where the notion of the city as mother is expanded into the rather grotesque image for the refoundation of Theos from Abdera. This identity of the speaker as the collective voice of the citizens persists through the poem. It emerges at 39 to 40, where whatever the supplement, we have a reference to a continuing struggle against enemy forces, and I think that is text 12 on the handout that I emailed. Marnamai, mar dios, says the speaker. Amid a chiaroscuro narrative of troubles and successes past and present, the speaker notes that a man should honour his parents. This, I'm afraid, is not on the text with you. A very astute formulation, because the poem goes on to speak about Thonos and about discord in the island. And what the speaker is doing, I think, throughout this poem is presenting the population as a kinship group, and therefore bidding for an image of the city as a consolidated, unified and harmonious whole. One interesting feature worth noting, and that's in text 11 that you have in front of you, is in line 29, the adjective Neopolis. Used of the citizen, it would mean belonging to a new city, as for instance in the formulation Dikaiopolis in Aristophanes. But again, of course, it may also suggest young city. So the adjective may come close to identifying speaker and city in a manner reminiscent of the Paean for Chaos. Text 13 on your handout, the Paean for Thebes, begins with a variation on the opening we've seen so far. It plunges us in medias res with the urgent invocation to the sun. It proceeds to turn this frightened inquiry into an intervention for the common good of the sort which opens the second and the fourth paeans, though again with much greater urgency. This poem also adjusts the expression of self. The cases we've been examining use singular forms to create the sense of a single collective persona, and I'll come back to that shortly. Effectively, they are exploiting an established slippage in the syntax and conception of the chorus. It's always physically, non-negotiably plural, and so commonly uses first-person plural forms. But it is also an entity, and as such can use the first-person singular to reflect its collective identity. In this poem, the singular is not collective at this point, but typical. This is not the citizen body as a whole, but a single concerned citizen voice. Line 21 of your handout, Ola furamida uden, hoti panton meta pesamide. Despite the difference in focus, however, the effect is again to speak for all, offering a representative view. And once more, the voice derives its authority in part from its loyalty to the common well-being in the face of menace. In the poems we've been looking at so far, self-definition by the group appears to be a major aspect of performance. But the differences between the two poems are as revealing as similarities. The Paean for Abdera was evidently performed at a festival in Abdera in honour of the eponymous hero. The Paean for Chaos was performed as part of a Theoria at an Ionian festival on Delos. These poems, for different reasons, place a high premium on collective self-representation. The Kean poem projects a geographical, ethical, and perhaps political identity into the Ionian Panegyris at Delos. The Acharonite Paean involves an act of self-representation by, and importantly to, the collective in the polis. Here the defining process has additional urgency against an explicit background of what looks like acknowledged discord in the past and in the face of external threat. It is, however, in the Parthenon that the most interesting effects are to be found. There is a striking paradox at the heart of the Parthenon, and at the heart of the construction of the young female in civic contexts. The current imagery across a range of genre presents the young female as a potential force of disruption. But we know that the female voice, or rather the virgin female voice, is in civic contexts authoritative. The image of collective female song is a recurrent one in lyric texts, regularly offered as a parallel, implicit or explicit, for male civic song. A good discussion of this in Tim Power's well-known article. So there is, theoretically, no more need for authorization here than in the case of men. But there is an important syntactical and gender difference. In most of the cases we've looked at, as with Isilos, the representativeness of the voice is mediated through a shifting presentation which locates the speaking voice intermittently inside and outside the civic group. There is, however, an inescapable fact of syntax and accidents that means that the female voice advertises itself always as a subset of the polis in any poetic statement, and a young, and in other contexts, disempowered subset. Hence perhaps the difference in the way the speaking voice relates to the collective. In Alcuin Fragment 3, his girls, unlike other cult singers, open with a gesture which distinguishes them from the larger group. But unlike the male choruses of the Paean, their first-person voice never becomes explicitly representative. Insofar as the chorus of Alcuin achieves a polis voice, it is through the inclusive mythic narrative rather than through the deictic elements. So the process of creating authority to speak for the whole is more demanding. It's an observable and long-observed fact that the self-representation of the speaker is much more extensive in the maiden chorus than in the Paean. In Pindar's Paeans for Keos and Abdera, the overt self-representation is both brief and highly localized, the overt self-identification, I should say. In the maiden song, it is a sustained effect throughout the composition. There is at least in the surviving examples, a profound element of apologia in the maiden song. In Alkmaar, this emerges as self-deprecation. Text 16, I think, on your handout. Self-deprecation, an inherently attractive characteristic in a society which places limits on women. What it does is it uses idealized gender stereotypes to give weight, which enhances authority. This is much more developed in Pindar, text 15, whose females explicitly deny any kind of statement to themselves which might be unsuitable to their virgin status. They then, however, paradoxically, as Giambattista d'Alessio observed a decade and a half ago, they then go on to make exactly the same kind of statements that we find in the male choruses of Pindar's Epiniceans. Statements that could as easily be made by a male civic chorus, and in fact some of them are. In the same way, Alkmaar's self-deprecating girls comment on large issues of piety, moderation, and hubris as readily as a male chorus would. So the self-deprecation is really part of a management process about mediating the civic voice rather than any genuine limitation on the female voice. I should say, however, that the way I've been describing this tends to make the whole thing look like a problem. And I think what one has in the choral poets is a challenge and an opportunity, in that I think the presence of unmarried girls in public space offers opportunities to create a kind of frisson, because there is always a kind of sensuality and indeed a potential sexuality in the presence of young girls subject to the gaze of males. Hence, I think the elements of flirtatiousness in Altmann's chorus, they are as coquettish as they are modest. It's worth pausing here very briefly to compare the effects that one gets in Corinna. Corinna, and I'll need to jump this because I'm aware that I'm trespassing on your time. What Corinna does is seemingly, as far as one can construct from her text, performs for the women of Tanagra. The only clear indication of audience in one of Corinna's fragments seemed to make a suggestive female audience. And what Corinna does is quite clearly avoids any kind of apologetic gesture. The female voice in female space need not apologize. What I'd like to do now is briefly run through some Horatian examples of the way in which Horace taps into this tradition. Horace is a very, very astute reader of the Greek lyric tradition, even where he is at his least explicit. And you should have on text 17a and 17b, Horace Odes 3:1 and Pindar P and 6. Horace in 3:1 at the opening explicitly uses the Pindaric bardic voice. Horace knows how to sound like Pindar at his most self-confident. This is, of course, more the Pindar of the Victory Odes than the Pindar of the cult song. It's worth noting, however, even here, something that we'll pick up again and again, the way in which Horace slips out of voice. And we start with that bardic voice, which looks like a sacerdotal voice. But by the time we get to the end of the poem, Horace has become a private citizen in private space, enjoying his individuality. Horace shows elsewhere that he is an acute observer, not just of the Pindaric victory voice, but also an observer of the cultic songs, and he's aware of the way in which voice shifts in the Greek cultic song, and he imitates it very cleverly. Although Horace, he also, I should say, uses these shifts to mediate the gap between the two environments of composition. There are different horizons of expectation in Yausian terms, and Horace is well aware of those shifted horizons. Though he presents himself as the heir to the Greek lyric poets in Odes 1:1, that's text 18, he is well aware that his world is a long way from that of Pindar and the Cyriades. This distance gives him advantages and disadvantages. It both liberates and constrains. And I start with the advantages. Greek lyric is shaped by performance. Genre very often performative moments, and not just texts, not just words, song and music. Now, it's important not to overstate the notion of genre as moment, because Greek lyric poetry is perfectly capable of playing with generic backgrounds. But nonetheless, lyric is to a large extent shaped by its performative moment. Horace, for the most part, is not. He is not operating in civic space, and so even his most public style is located outside civic performance. And this gives him some of the freedom available to the tragic poet, in that he can create genre he can create performative moment by the which he uses by overt and inovert deixis. But the disadvantages, of course, are that the lyric poet in the Greek context is the civic voice, at least in cult song, and it becomes very difficult in a Roman context to speak for the collective, particularly within some of the tensions as Rome moves from the Republic to the Principate. Shifts in voice and person for Horace become a very effective device for generating a collective and stimulating consensus by suggestion rather than by explicit demand or claim. A good example of these shifts you can see in text 19 on your handout. Augustus has returned from Gaul. The speaking voice there begins with a prayer-like request for Augustus's return, solemn in tone and public in voice, in the limited sense that the speaker emphasizes the collective desire for the return. The collective desire retains foregrounded in what follows, where the ode makes very effective use of third-person reactions to the return of Augustus to create a persuasive narrative of inclusiveness. He also, of course, takes in passing and very cleverly elements of theocracy and lyric in order to create a golden age, an implied golden age image of Augustan Rome. But the speaker is unidentified, or rather, there is no reason to see anyone but the poet as the speaker. There is, however, a palpable shift which emerges gradually. From lines 29 and following, the poem emphasizes simple rustic celebration in drink. Again, third person, and again, the words which open the final stanza could be the poet's voice, especially as it is identified as quotation only in retrospect. It begins as though it could be the poet alone expressing his own sentiments. But very cleverly, Horace allows it to turn into something more suggestive. The first person plural here, dicemos, is designedly unspecific. Who exactly is included in the we is unclear. It could be the pluralis maestatis. It could be the regular singular of the poetic piece, or it could be a statement on behalf of the collective. The ambiguity means that it can simultaneously represent both the poetic voice and the population at large. The sense that we have a communal voice is increased by the reference to drinking at the close and to holidays in the first line of the last stanza. These pick up the rustic celebrations mentioned in lines 29 to 36 and create a seamless continuity with the preceding stanzas. In this way, the speaker becomes the representative of the collective, and the plural approximates to a choral voice. The engagement with Greek cultic lyric here is very subtle. The performative Greek lyric lies behind the public voice in this text. It's striking that Horace substitutes here for the large civic festivals of the Greek ritual song tradition a much more homespun event, and one which is unambiguously Italian. It's also marked by an element of informality that facilitates the clever shift between public and private. The last point to stress here is the emphasis on iteration, dikemos, twice there. The suggestion that these celebrations, as described, are a recurrent event. The idea of iteration is a constant, explicit feature of Greek cultic lyric, and here it's appropriated for Horace's collective and recurrent celebrations. The opposite modulation between public and private is affected in the earlier Odes 3:14, and that's text 20 on your handout. The voice at the beginning is unambiguously public. O plebs, says Horace, and authoritative. The civic rejoicing here is instruction rather than fact or prediction. Again, however, the voice is unidentified. It acquires precision only as it moves towards the private in the latter half. The instructions there for a purely private celebration, are for a purely private celebration, and the speaker is not an unspecified representative of collective authority, but a very embarrassed Pompeian, aware of the fact that he was on the wrong side. This is less, I think, a frank presentation of the psychology of a former opponent, awkwardly aware of his change of stance, than a very careful use of the individual experience to suggest a collective truth. The recollection of a bygone age and Horace's youth attests the public benefit created by the current regime by the simple completeness of Horace's volte-face, and that itself, of course, is a tribute to the piece brought by Augustus. Public and private again coexist, but the movement in the voice is much more overt. Again, however, and this is probably the most important for all of the very simple thing that I have to say, the lack of context, occasion, its historical moment, not performance, allows complex shift combinations. My last text, and I'll romp through this in seconds, is text 21. It's Horace 4:15, and it's the complex Horatian voice at its most sophisticated. It follows the opposite trajectory. It begins with a very tired recusatio. The god warns the poet of epic themes. But instead of a recusatio on the ground of Polynepian poetics, it becomes a rejection of military themes as outdated in an age when Augustus has created lasting peace. This kind of song is simply passé. Here the general piece becomes a rustic festival, and Augustus, by implication through the figures of Troy and Venus, is absorbed into the tradition, becoming part of a recurrent celebration, potentially iterated endlessly, as the future plural indicates. The first person plural in the last two stanzas, culminating aptly in the closing verb of singing, takes us back by ring form to the opening moment and expands to include the whole population. There is a noteworthy difference, and I'm right at the end of my time, so I will sprint. There's a noteworthy difference in the way the collective is constructed in Horace, and this is something I'd like to do more work on. Horace and his Greek exemplars. The Greek choral lyric frequently generates inclusivity with the use of the collective first-person singular, which in choral performance vividly conveys unity in the contrast between the seen group and its single voice. However, when stripped of an explicitly civic context, the first person loses its capacity to speak for the collective, and it develops a tendency to individualize. It takes us unambiguously towards monody. Without performance, the singular suggests the individual voice, and that, I think, is one of the main reasons why Horace uses the first person plural to create the effects of inclusion. That is, by my reckoning, 30 minutes and the top end of the time frame that Nikolai gave me. Thank you for your patience. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much for a brilliant paper. Now questions. Вопросы, если у кого-то есть. Если у кого-то есть вопросы, давайте. Да. Давайте.
Is it possible to see this singular ending as a mark of everyone that himself is involved to express his opinion? I mean, the same we may find in pronouns when we say this is not many I who speaks, but this is many personalities. Yes, it's a linguistic problem which may be reflected in all this choral
Sorry, yes, I'm not sure that I heard correctly, but I didn't catch the ending, but I did catch the beginning, and I think that there is a sense in which the speaker as the chorus as a unity always is to some extent an individual separate, but I think at the same time, because one is looking at a group which is uttering the singular, I think the effect is to create a sense of a unified unity. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yes, it was.
But I think there is an inherent ambiguity throughout.
Я задал вопрос о том, нельзя ли рассматривать коллективное как выражение чувства каждого из участников хора. Ну, так же, как местоимение множественного числа, то это не обозначает, что это размноженное «я», да? А это как бы вот группа, где каждый может выступать с местоимениями. Так, значит, профессор Керри считает, что лучше говорить о коллективном «я», так сказать. Можно я еще вопрос? My second question is about Musa Ligenia. We have in different choral pieces of choral lyrics. This Musa Ligenia, presumably chorus of women, had a special tone to perform the piece. What do you think about it? Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Could I have the question again, Professor? Because the Parthenon is one of the things which interests me most. And I think it's the one where I said least, and on which I was least satisfactory.
Well, the question was concerning. That's Nikolai speaking, actually. Now Nikolai.
Yes, I saw. Is that Professor Kazansky? No?
Okay. That was Nikolai Kazansky before. So the question of Nikolai Kazansky was concerning the expression Mosa Ligenia, because it can correspond, in his view, to the alternations of tone, of the higher tone of the performance, like in Greek folklore song. Do you think that there is such an expression can reflect the idea of musical performance?
And the word, I'm terribly sorry, Nikolai, I'm losing a lot. It was the expression...
Mosa Ligenia. Musa Ligenia.
Yes, I'm terribly sorry. Yes, I think it much... I am far less well versed in Greek music than I suspect everyone in the room with you. But there is a strong tendency, isn't there, to associate... First, I think there is an aesthetic aspect to this, in that in words like Ligius have an aesthetic element to them, apart from anything else. But I think they also, they probably do also have a pitch idea. I've not looked to see how often one gets this in the victory odes, and therefore the extent to which one can map this firmly onto performance. It may be that Ewan or Lucia has the texts in their head. I can see them on the left-hand side of my vision, but certainly it seems to me entirely possible that there may be a pragmatic, in a very narrow sense, aspect to this, as well as merely an aesthetic and laudatory element.
I'll briefly translate you in Russian.
Ответ профессора Керри касался того, что да, возможно, хотя он, конечно, имеет весьма мало представления, меньше представления, кто бы то ни было, о том, как устроена была греческая музыка, что неправда. Но полагаю, что, конечно, возможно, здесь речь идет о некотором повышении тона, надо еще посмотреть, как это употребляется в разных типах лирических произведений. Но, с другой стороны, здесь очень важно, что этот термин «лирус», конечно, несет в себе еще и большой эстетический элемент, просто некоторые характеристики стиля и текста.
Any other questions? Jenny.
Not a question really. Not a question really, but Chris, unbeknownst to you, your paper and Lukia's paper made a splendid pair, and both, I think, took the immense problem for Horace to take the Greek tradition, specifically Pindar, and revise it for a completely different world. And so both of you really did a lovely job in bringing that across.
Can I ask Jenny? It doesn't surprise me that Lucia and I are on the same page, because Lucia and I usually do see eye to eye. What was Lucia's topic? I cannot recall.
Chris Pindar stile Ainulari.
Yeah, it was Pindarum Quisque Studet Aemulari, celebratory occasion in Pindar and Horace.
Yes. Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Замечание профессора Клей было к тому, что два доклада, доклад профессора Танасаки и профессора Керри, составляют замечательную пару, демонстрирующую, насколько тяжело было Горацио приспособить греческие образцы к иному социальному контексту. Профессор Керри на это ответил, что его совершенно не удивляет, что они с Луки и Танасаки оказываются даже на расстоянии вместе, потому что они всегда смотрят на все одними глазами.
But was there a question I missed, Jenny?
No, it was just a compliment. A complimentary compliment.
Еще какие-то вопросы?
This is a question a bit about scholarly literature. I mean, do you find helpful the work, an old work of Mari Camillo, Finnish author, who dedicated the whole book on the pluralism of the first person and singular of the first person in tragedy?
Yeah. I have used Cameo many times, and yes, I think it is a work of fundamental importance, and I think much of what we are getting in choral lyric outside tragedy is actually mapping onto to what we find in tragedy, in the way that the syntax, and with it, I think, the way in which one perceives the chorus and the chorus perceives maps onto the way it shifts and reflects the different ways of thinking about the chorus. I think non-tragic choral lyric is in many ways using very similar very similar techniques. It would be really interesting to have more cult song, because at the moment the emphasis seems to be much more on the first person, simply in terms of, in quantitative terms, frequency. But I suspect that if we had more, we would find much more of the modulation between the first person singular and the first person plural than we have at the moment, and a much greater convergence with tragedy. The complicated one, I think, is the epiniceum, where the first person moves away from both tragedy and cult lyric, for the most part, not all cult lyric, and develops this rather ambiguous voice between the plural and a singular, which is unique to an individual. But I think Kaimio's work remains very relevant to what we find in non-dramatic lyric, and I think not just classical, not just archaic and classical, but also, I think, Hellenistic. But it remains, I think, as relevant to that as it is to tragedy.
Давайте.
Вопрос я переведу.
Значит,
Я спросила о работе, старой работе 90-го года Маргарет Камио,
О трагедии.
посвящена очень детальному разбору функций первого лица единственного числа для хоровых песен трагедии, насколько ее анализ полезен для анализа лирики.
Ответ был да, безусловно, профессор Керри многократно использовал Камио и действительно считает, что эта работа значима во многом и для исследования нетематической хоровой лирики. Правда, здесь, поскольку демонстрирует очень сложное взаимодействие между формами множественного и единственного числа с постоянным подключением регистров, но при этом было бы чрезвычайно интересно, если бы мы имели большее количество культовых песен, с которыми наиболее близость могла продемонстрировать эта методология, поскольку с точки зрения профессора Керри и Ники как раз занимает несколько особое место, потому что динамика соотношения первого лица множественного числа и первого лица единственного числа в Ники отличается от того, что мы встречаем в культовой песне, и обладает гораздо большей двусмысленностью и нюансировкой.
Thank you, Chris, for a great paper, and I'm now going to put up a flag for my old friend Alcaeus. Because here we have a lot of poems where he is speaking in the first person plural, and we're in a very different sort of situation from Kant, but nevertheless, it seems to me that group of poems where the first person plural has a clear reference that's pretty unambiguous ought to be a guide for us, as it might have been for audiences in the 6th and 5th centuries, about what first person plurals can do.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. The one of the contexts I'm trying to replay my Alcaeus in my head, and one of the contexts clearly is the symphotic context. Is it ponomen? Let's drink. And one of the contexts clearly is that of actually a different kind of deixis, where actually no, it's not a different kind of deixis. It's merely a private way of projecting group identity comparable with what one gets in public contexts, in that what you have is a first person plural voice which identifies the speaker with the group, and which is effectively defining a moment, a performative moment, and an audience, and of course is also defining a reperformative moment, in that every time one uses those words on subsequent occasions, one has the same inclusive deictic gesture. What I haven't done, Ewan, is to look hard at the political poems and to see how often Alcaeus uses this person plural there, and it certainly does. And sometimes, of course, it is the faction, and sometimes it should be clearly demarcated from, say, the Damos of Lesbos. What would be interesting to see, and maybe you've done this, is to see how often he uses a more inclusive first-person plural in order to, as it were, redefine the relationship between his particular faction, his hetaireia, and the larger interests of the city. And you may want to come back at me on that. But certainly I think all of the gestures that one gets in Horace and in choral lyric are theoretically and I think also practically possible within monodic lyric, in that what one is doing always, I think, is trying to generate an audience and to shape the moment. And I think there is a profoundly performative aspect to all of this. So certainly I think all of the things that I've spoken about would repay further analysis within, I think particularly symptotic poets like Alcaeus and Anacreon, and also I think with reference to the Sapphic group and the way Sappho uses their syntax. This takes us back to Professor Kazansky's first question, I think.
Да, значит, вопрос профессора Боуи касался привнесения в анализ поэзии Алкея, за которым он всегда вступается, и, соответственно, расширение лирической традиции на что, как возможного фона для того, какой стратегии придерживается Гораций. Что профессор Керри, отвечая на это, сказал, что когда говорит об Алкее, то прежде всего имеет в виду его стихи на симпосии, где первое лицо множественного числа говорит скорее похожий тезис, но не совсем тот же, поскольку включается я говорит от лица определенной группы. Соответственно, интересно было бы посмотреть еще на политические стихотворения Алкея, где в действительности, профессор Керри, не помню, но наверняка он тоже говорит «мы», и посмотреть на некоторые, так сказать, сложность соотнесения вот этого персонализованного «я», говорящего от лица, персонализованного «мы», говорящего от лица Гиперии, и всего народа Лесбоса. В любом случае, он может сказать, что все, что мы имеем у Горация, конечно, восходит к очень сложной системе лирической традиции, в которой, и это возвращает нас к вопросу профессора Казанского, что в действительности нюансировка «мы» и его соотношение с «я» зависит во многом от некоторых жанровых характеристик.
Thank you very much. I think that now we are out of time. So thank you so much for bringing that paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I thank you for your patience and wish you every success with your conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.